Welcome back. Rooster Town is not a community you will find on any modern maps, but between 1901 and the late 1950s, it was a tight-knit community of Métis families in Manitoba that banded together in the face of dispossession by the government and non-indigenous settlers. It had sprouted up on the outskirts of Winnipeg, now home to a school, library, and shopping mall. APTN News social media editor Savannah Kelly has been looking back on Rooster Town's significance and recently wrote a story about it, and she joins us now. Savannah, nice to see you. Thanks for coming in and taking a few minutes out of your day.
Thanks for having me on the show, Daryl.
So, for our viewers who have not heard of Rooster Town before, can you explain a bit about the community and how it all came to be?
Absolutely. So Rooster Town, which was also known as Paquin Town, was what's known as an urban, like Métis fringe community, or just a fringe community. So it was actually only one of 26 such communities that existed in Manitoba around that kind of similar time frame. So in 1901, it was formed kind of on the outskirts of Winnipeg, and what led to its original formation kind of goes back to the Manitoba Act of 1870. So Manitoba Act of 1870 promised 1.4 million acres of land to Métis living in Manitoba. As the influx of settlers coming in and Manitoba joining Confederation, it was a way to ensure that Métis could continue to have their land, communities, and way of life. But unfortunately, that's not really how it played out. So there were long delays in implementing these lands, and it kind of led to this thing. Okay, so the story kind of goes back. I used this book that used a lot of research on Rooster Town, and they referred to it as a form of institutionalized neglect. So sometimes these delays in implementing these land acknowledgements, or promises, I should say, would span decades. So in the meantime, like, Métis were basically dispossessed from their lands. When they were granted these lands, they were often scattered. So in the meantime, as these decades passed, non-Métis settlers came in, they got mostly these prime parcels of land, while Métis were kind of scattered to the four winds, so it made it very difficult for these communities to stay together. So Rooster Town kind of sprouted up as an answer to that. So these Métis families and communities that were kind of pushed out of their previous ways of life were able to kind of gather together and have a new community kind of on the fringes of urban settlement, so they could still participate in the urban economy after being pushed out of their previous ways of life.
And now, Rooster Town existed for about 60 years or so, right? So what are the circumstances that led to the community's dispersal?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So the community did exist for about 60 years, from 1901 to the late 1950s, and what it really boiled down to was Winnipeg got bigger. So when Rooster Town originally was formed, it was really undeveloped land, so a lot of these residents were able to do subsistence farming, again, participating in the urban economy, but they were cut off from city amenities, so they didn't have plumbing, electricity, access to public transportation, and things like that. But as Winnipeg continued to grow over those decades, it became apparent that residents that were part of Winnipeg, that were non-Indigenous residents, were starting to look at Rooster Town as a community that was kind of in the way of progress. And a lot of these houses were built on city-owned land for Rooster Town residents, although they did buy the land that their houses were on when they could afford to do so. But it led newspaper articles in the city itself to kind of refer to them as squatters. So a lot of the articles that you would see in the Winnipeg Tribune and similar papers that existed at the time during like the 40s and into the late 1950s started kind of referring to Rooster Town and covering their community in this negative light, referring to them as living in squalor and things like that. And that kind of went with the sort of racist prevailing attitudes at the time, where families in Winnipeg didn't want their kids playing with kids from Rooster Town because they could catch diseases and things like that, which is so far from the truth. I was able to speak with a man named Daryl Says, whose father and grandfather both lived in Rooster Town. His father was born and raised there, and he was like, these negative perceptions that kind of persisted in newspapers at the time were so far from the truth. And also, they weren't written in context of Métis dispossession from their lands. So it's easy for someone who's living in Winnipeg with access to those modern amenities to look at this community and kind of snub their nose to it and look at the negatives, when really it didn't acknowledge that that context of these people formed this community in the face of dispossession from their original ways of being. So those kind of perceptions plus Winnipeg expanding led to the community ending up being forcefully removed in 1959.
So how is the community being remembered now, Savannah?
That's interesting as well, because when the community was first dispersed, it kind of went underground. There wasn't acknowledgement. So even my mom, she's Métis. She grew up in the Grant Park area, attended Grant Park High School, which exists on the land where Rooster Town used to be. And so that would have been in the 70s, and she had never heard of it. 15 years, 20 years after the fact, had no idea of this community's previous existence. But now in the last few years, there's been more of a push to acknowledge the community and the residents, because like a lot of darker chapters for Indigenous people in now the history of Canada, this isn't ancient history. This exists still in the living memory of Métis people in Manitoba and Winnipeg today. So it's been interesting to see in the last 5 years or so, there's been a lot more acknowledgement. So a couple things that spring to mind would be in 2019, there were a couple of art installations in the city by an artist named Ian August called Rooster Town Kettle, and I believe the other one's called Fetching Water. And they're installations that kind of show and acknowledge Rooster Town and what life was like for residents without running water at the time. So the Fetching Water, the Rooster Town Kettle, I should say, art installation is a giant kettle in the city that is the size that would show how much water those residents needed to haul every single day, 250 residents. So it's this massive kettle and kind of a testament to the resilience of that community. And in addition, so there's a library in the city, the Bill and Helen Norrie Library, which is also built on the ground where Rooster Town used to stand, and they've done a good job of reaching out to residents, like generational residents and people from Rooster Town, to kind of do consultations on what they can do to acknowledge that the community did stand there. So you can see on the outside of the library, there's metal engravings showing, things related to life in Rooster Town, like boiling water, like a kettle on the stove, a mother holding her daughter's hand, which was based on a real photo that was taken in Rooster Town. If you go inside, they've got books on Rooster Town and artifacts as well. And I know that there's also consultations with the Pan Am Pool for possibly renaming it to honor that they're also on the land of Rooster Town. So it's really nice to see that in the last few years, there's this real push to acknowledge the community and make sure that residents know, because it's kind of been so long that it's good that they're finally kind of getting that acknowledgement.
All right, well, thanks for that, Savannah. You can read much more about Rooster Town on our website, aptnnews.ca. Savannah, thanks for coming in. Always a pleasure chatting.
Thanks, Daryl.